sound of crutches hitting pavement wasn't loud, just a sharp clatter, but it cut through the laughter of the HOA picnic like a gunshot in a church. It happened in less than a second. One moment, my wife was walking toward the dessert table, her balance careful, her posture proud. The next, she was sprawled on the gravel, palms scraped bloody, breath knocked out of her chest, and standing over her, heels dug in like a queen on a chessboard, was Barbara Evans, the self-crowned monarch of the Rosewood Hills Homeowners Association. 57 years old, sun-kissed from too many poolside inspections, Barbara was the kind of woman who never met a rule she didn't think she should invent or enforce. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize, just cocked her head and said, "Guess that limp was more theater than truth. Maybe sign up for the neighborhood play next time, sweetheart." It was our third day living here. I froze, mid-step, a tray of cornbread muffins trembling in my hands. My wife, Lena, gasped, less from pain, more from the shock. I rushed forward, kneeling beside her. She was already pushing herself up, slow but steady, gravel clinging to her palms. Her face was pale, jaw set. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She was thinking. See, Barbara thought she had just humiliated a fragile woman who didn't belong. What she didn't know, what no one at that picnic knew, was that Lena wasn't just a new neighbor with mobility issues. She was Judge Lena Whitmore, newly appointed to the District Court of Clark County. And the same HOA that Barbara weaponized like her own private army? Yeah. They were under preliminary investigation for misappropriation of funds and code enforcement fraud. I looked up and saw phones already out, some filming, others snapping pictures. A teenager with bright blue hair muttered, "Yo, she just assaulted her," while recording Barbara's smug stance. Another neighbor, Mr. Halpern, I think, was staring with his jaw slightly agape, holding a paper plate of chili that had stopped steaming. Barbara turned her back like she'd just swatted a fly. "Let that be a lesson," she called over her shoulder. "This is a community for the able and responsible." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't boo either. Just silence. That heavy, awkward kind of silence that makes your skin itch. Then someone stepped forward, a man with gray stubble and an old cane. He held out his hand to Lena. "Come on, miss. Let's get you up. And don't mind her. She's been poisoned since 9. We thanked him. His name was Thomas Briggs, and as we later learned, he was one of many residents who had been chewed up and spit out by the HOA's iron grip, but never had the leverage to fight back. As we walked back to our house, me pushing Lena, gently, in her transport chair, we said nothing. I knew that look in her eye, the same one she wore the day she sentenced a city official for racketeering, using nothing but a timeline and a stack of subpoenaed emails. Lena didn't get mad. She prepared. That night, she didn't even ice her palms. She opened her laptop, pulled up the state's municipal code, and started a spreadsheet. "What are you doing?" I asked quietly. "Just organizing," she said. The next morning, a note was taped to our door. HOA stationery. Polite font. It read, "Please refrain from leaving mobility devices unattended on port structures." We hadn't. The chair was tucked in our entryway, but apparently in Rosewood Hills, facts were optional. Lena folded the note with a smile and filed it under a new tab labeled Pattern of Hostility. Day 3, we got a violation citation for the house numbers on our mailbox. Apparently they weren't in sanctioned HOA typeface. Barbara had knocked on our door herself to explain it, smile tight, lips glossed in aggression. "We don't want our neighborhood looking disjointed," she said. Continuity is culture. I swear she practiced that line in a mirror. Lena didn't say a word. Just nodded, wrote down the citation number, and shut the door. By Friday, the HOA newsletter featured a tone-deaf article titled "Celebrating Strength Through Contribution," where Barbara encouraged all residents to engage physically and visibly in maintaining the beauty of Rosewood. Lena highlighted 3 phrases, pasted them into her file, and whispered, "That's going to play well in court." That evening, Thomas stopped by with a bottle of root beer and an offer to help fix a fence post we hadn't even noticed was slightly tilted. "She's always like that," he said, nodding toward Barbara's house. "Takes your piece and twists it into a problem. But we've all been too tired to fight." "Not anymore," Lena murmured. "That weekend, we didn't go out. We watched, observed, collected." The final straw, at least for part 1 of this saga, came Sunday morning. We found a second notice in our mailbox. "Illegal ramp installation, subject to fine." The ramp in question? It was installed per ADA regulations, approved by the county 2 weeks prior, and constructed with grant money Lena had helped secure in her previous legal role. She chuckled. She just stepped on a landmine. I looked at her. "You're really going to do this, aren't you?" Lena nodded. "She turned this neighborhood into a courtroom. Now I'm going to show her what real justice looks like." And just like that, the woman who kicked a judge's crutches in front of 50 witnesses and 3 iPhones had unknowingly kicked down the doors of the one courtroom that was never hers to control. The Monday after the picnic, a strange hush fell over the neighborhood. You could almost feel it in the way people walked. Heads lowered, steps slower, as if the pavement itself held secrets they didn't want to step on. Barbara hadn't shown her face since the incident, but her fingerprints were everywhere. The HOA bulletin board outside the clubhouse had a fresh notice pinned up. "Community reminder. Residents are expected to uphold standards of dignity and decorum. No exceptions." It wasn't signed, but everyone knew. We didn't reply. We didn't need to. By noon, Lena had compiled 6 formal violations from our first 3 days. 3 of them legally baseless, the other 3 outright discriminatory. She printed them, hole-punched the stack, and slid it into a binder labeled "Rosewood Hills, the Civil Pattern of Misconduct." The title was matter-of-fact. The contents were anything but. Later that day, Thomas came by with a flash drive. His eyes were weary, but his voice carried steel. "You need to see this." He explained that an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Clara Vaughn, a retired teacher in her late 70s, had just had her mailbox removed. Not vandalized, not broken. Removed. By HOA contractors. On Barbara's order. Why? Because the mailbox, according to Barbara's visual audit, stood 2 inches too close to the sidewalk. Clara, who walked with a cane and lived alone, had pleaded with them to wait. She even offered to adjust it herself. They ignored her. Then, when she went to Barbara's porch to complain, she was served a written warning for disrupting administrative processes. The video Thomas handed us wasn't high quality. A shaky cell phone recording taken from across the street, but it captured enough. The way Clara stood there, confused. The workers' laugh. The audible clunk of metal against truck bed. Lena didn't speak for a while after watching it. Her face had gone still, eyes narrowed in that focused way I recognized too well. She wasn't just documenting anymore. She was building a case. That evening, she opened 3 more browser tabs and began filing public records requests, permits, budget reports, code enforcement logs. In under 2 hours, she discovered that most of the violations issued in the past year hadn't come from the city, but from HOA letterhead using municipal-style formatting. That was illegal. Pretending to act under the authority of a government agency. It's not just HOA bullying. It's impersonation. It's fraud. She didn't yell, didn't swear, just nodded once to herself and said, "We're past civil. This is going federal." That night, I sat on the porch while she drafted a preliminary complaint to the state attorney general's office, documenting the growing pattern of intimidation, ADA violations, and unauthorized enforcement practices. I'd seen her write a dozen such filings in her career, but this one was different. This one came with blood under her fingernails and bandages on her palms. She paused, only once, looking over at me. "She's not just cruel," Lena said. "She's weaponized the law like it's a hobby." Tuesday morning brought a new layer of madness. As I was rinsing soap off the truck in our driveway, Barbara reappeared, clipboard in hand, measuring tape dangling from her wrist like some kind of suburban sheriff's badge. She didn't knock. She didn't announce herself. She walked straight up our steps and began measuring the porch frame. "Excuse me?" I called out, water still running from the hose. She didn't stop, just mumbled something about non-compliant porch depth and continued clicking measurements like she was on an HGTV segment gone rogue. "You're trespassing," I said, stepping between her and the doorway. Barbara didn't blink. "As HOA president, I have inspection rights." Her laughed. Once, dry and sharp. "You don't have squat. This isn't a strip mall, Barbara. It's our home. And your rules end at the property line." She rolled her eyes, took a photo with her phone, and strutted down the path like she'd just scored a victory. I turned to see Lena watching through the window. Her expression didn't shift, but I knew. I knew what was coming next. By noon, she had found something unexpected. Our home, the one we'd bought 2 months ago, was added to the HOA's jurisdiction less than a year ago through a so-called annexation amendment. An amendment never signed by the previous owners. In other words, our house may not even be legally bound by HOA rules at all. She pulled up satellite maps, zoning records, and scanned the annexation file line by line. There it was. A missing signature. No notarization. No legal chain of consent. I watched the slow smile creep across her face. "If this is true," she said quietly, "Barbara's not just harassing us. She's unlawfully enforcing jurisdiction over at least a dozen homes that were annexed the same way." "Class action?" I asked. She nodded. "Easily." Wednesday evening, we met with Thomas and Clara on our back porch. Lena walked out using her crutches, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, as a statement. She laid out the annexation documents, her findings, and what it meant for the others. Clara looked like she was about to cry. Thomas leaned back, shaking his head in awe. "She thought you were weak," he said slowly. "But she doesn't know what a quiet storm looks like." The very next day, Barbara returned, this time with 2 board members in tow. She handed us a laminated packet of final violation notices, demanding we remove the ADA-compliant ramp and repaint our porch in approved neutral tones within 5 days or face escalating fines and third-party correction fees. Lena took the packet, flipped through the pages, then looked Barbara squarely in the eye and said, "Thank you. We'll be responding through legal channels." Barbara's expression cracked. "Legal channels?" she scoffed. Lena smiled. "Yes, Clause 18 of your own HOA charter. You should probably reread it." Barbara left in a hurry that day. She didn't know it yet, but the storm had already begun. Lena wasn't gathering evidence anymore. She was sharpening the blade. By Friday morning, Rosewood Hills felt different. It wasn't just the weather, which had turned overcast, like the sky itself was holding its breath, but something in the air. The neighbors walked their dogs a little quicker. Fewer people waved. Mailboxes stayed shut longer. It was like the whole community had entered a quiet state of bracing. And Barbara? She doubled down. That afternoon, a thick manila envelope was wedged into our front door frame. Inside was a formal summons to a disciplinary hearing, typed in size 12 Times New Roman and dripping with self-importance. The language was florid and hysterical. Repeated non-compliance, willful disruption of community harmony, defamation of the HOA board. Defamation, Lena muttered, her voice flat. That's cute. The hearing was scheduled for Sunday evening at the community clubhouse. Attendance mandatory, the letter said with ominous flair. Lena folded it in half, placed it in her binder labeled litigation prep, and said, "She's spiraling." And she was. Saturday brought another HOA-wide flyer slipped into every mailbox. This one was titled, "Restoring Order, Why We Must Stand United." It was 4 pages long, filled with vague accusations about outside influences, agitators, and how certain residents had weaponized personal misfortune to undermine the community. On the second page, there was a photo of Lena, taken at the potluck, zoomed in, and poorly edited to darken the image, as if trying to paint her as menacing. Beneath it was a caption. Some residents claim to know the law, but who are they really protecting? It was laughable. And yet, something in Lena's eyes changed when she saw it. Not anger, not fear, just calculation. That night, Trey dropped by with a USB drive and a stack of documents. He didn't sit down. He just placed them on the porch table and said, "That's the dirt." It was more than dirt. It was a minefield. The flash drive contained scanned HOA financial records from the past 2 years, obtained by a friend of Trey's who had once served on the board before Barbara pushed him out. The records were riddled with red flags. A $90,000 0-cents landscaping project billed to a company named Silver Fern Solutions, which, after a quick search, turned out to be a shell company registered to Barbara's second cousin. Another $45,000 0-cents allocated to legal advisory services. With no case numbers, no firm name, just line items appearing every month like clockwork. And then there was the kicker. An $18,000 0-cents community improvement fee labeled Phase 1 Security Audit, paid to an entity that didn't exist on any local business registry. Lena's fingers flew across her keyboard. Within 15 minutes, she traced all 3 vendors to relatives, shell addresses, and disconnected phone numbers. Classic embezzlement, she whispered. I watched her pull up the contact sheet for the state auditor's office. You reporting it? I asked. Already did, she replied, her voice low but firm. Now we build the public case. Sunday arrived like a storm front. The HOA clubhouse, normally reserved for bunco nights and bake sale meetings, was transformed into a trial stage. Rows of plastic folding chairs had been set out. A podium stood at the front, flanked by 2 HOA board members and a very nervous-looking treasurer. Barbara stood behind it, clutching her clipboard like a gavel. She arrived precisely on time. Lena wore a pale blue blouse, black slacks, and a single silver chain around her neck. Not flashy, not loud, but unmistakably judicial. She held a file folder under one arm. thicker than anything Barbara could have anticipated. Barbara cleared her throat, smiling at the room like a mayor addressing a disaster she caused. Thank you all for coming. Tonight's meeting is to address ongoing disruptions caused by new residents who've shown a concerning disregard for our community's values. She didn't say Lena's name. She didn't have to. After 20 minutes of theatrical grievances, none of them backed by facts, Barbara finally called on Lena to respond. Lena stood slowly, calm. Thank you, she said, nodding once. I'd like to begin by quoting from your own HOA charter, Clause 17, subsection 3. He pulled out a copy and read aloud. No resident shall be summoned to disciplinary hearing without at least 10 days' notice, written evidence of violations, and access to a neutral adjudicator not affiliated with the HOA board. She looked up, her tone razor-sharp. Tonight's hearing violates every part of that. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Barbara opened her mouth to respond, but Lena continued, unflinching. Furthermore, she said, turning to page 2, this packet contains documented evidence of financial impropriety under your leadership, including but not limited to unregistered vendors, misused funds, and unexplained budget allocations. She handed copies to every board member. The treasurer blinked. The secretary's hands trembled. Barbara's smile cracked. I'm also submitting these findings, Lena added, to the state's Auditor General and to the Attorney General's Fraud Investigation Unit. This community deserves accountability, not fear, not manipulation. Barbara lunged toward the podium. This is slander. Lena didn't even blink. It's evidence, she replied. And then came the final blow. Lena handed out one last document, a notarized letter from the county assessor's office confirming that our property and at least 15 others were never legally annexed into the HOA due to improper procedures and missing consents. Therefore, she concluded, you've not only harassed us unlawfully, but you've been collecting fines, issuing violations, and enforcing jurisdiction you do not possess. And the room went dead silent. Then someone clapped. Then another. Barbara shouted, this meeting is adjourned. But no one moved. The ground beneath her had cracked. The clipboard was no longer a weapon, it was just plastic. We left the clubhouse not in silence, but surrounded by whispers, quiet thanks, and the unmistakable sound of power shifting. Lena didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She'd arrived with crutches and walked out carrying justice. The next 48 hours felt like the slow detonation of a fault line. Quiet at first, but you could feel the tremors underfoot. By Monday morning, the mood in Rosewood Hills had shifted again. But not like before. It wasn't dread. It was something more dangerous to people like Barbara. Awareness. People had seen the receipts, heard the contradictions, watched her stammer through Lena's quiet dismantling of her empire. Now they were asking questions she could no longer silence with a violation notice or a smirk. That afternoon, Trey stopped by our porch with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. He handed Lena a manila envelope with a post-it. From one of the quiet ones. You've got more allies than you think. Inside, more financial documents. This time, handwritten notes from past board meetings, detailing backdoor deals, inflated contracts, and committee votes that never actually happened. One entry read, Barbara says to rush the Silver Fern invoice. Don't wait for approval, it's already handled. Lena filed it under misappropriation evidence, then opened her laptop. The audit request had been acknowledged. The complaint had been assigned a case number. The state's Attorney General's office had sent a confirmation email. Preliminary inquiry opened. Please do not disclose. Barbara had no idea, or maybe she did, because by Tuesday morning she launched her most desperate move yet. We woke to a fresh flyer on our doorstep. This time, it wasn't printed on plain white paper. It was glossy. Full color, professionally designed. At the top, Rosewood Integrity Initiative. Below that, a long-winded message accusing unnamed residents of orchestrating a smear campaign against the HOA. She talked about outside influence, manipulated documents, and a former judge who may be using her position for personal revenge. She finally said Lena's name. And that was her mistake. That afternoon, Lena didn't raise her voice. She just picked up her phone and made a call to the state bar. Not as a judge. As a citizen, defamed in writing. Barbara didn't know it yet, but the clock had started ticking louder. That evening, we sat on the porch. The sun was low, spilling gold across the street. Neighbors walked past more slowly now. Some waved, some nodded. A few crossed the street just to say thank you. One woman, May from 2 doors down, handed Lena a USB stick with 3 years' worth of HOA newsletters. "Figured you'd want the originals," she said, then whispered, "I was on the board once, for 6 weeks, until she pushed me out." Every piece mattered. And Lena? And just kept building. By Wednesday, Barbara had filed an emergency request for a closed-door board vote to suspend community privileges for households causing continued legal disruption. It was a thinly veiled attempt to punish us, to isolate us. The meeting was set for Friday, no residents allowed, no cameras, no votes from outside board members. But Barbara forgot one thing. Trey was still a notary public and still had access to the HOA's original charter. And that charter required full transparency for any vote involving punitive action against residents. We showed up anyway. Lena walked into the boardroom, not with lawyers or press or protest, but with one printed copy of the HOA's own rules. She handed it to the secretary. "You hold this vote without public notice," she said calmly, "and every decision you make tonight becomes invalid by sunrise." Barbara's lips curled. "You're not the judge here." Lena tilted her head slightly. "No," she said, "but I know the law better than you know how to lie." Barbara tried to speak again, but the murmurs from behind us were already growing. Neighbors had gathered. Some had chairs. Some had phones. All had stories. Trey stepped forward, holding up his phone. Barbara, he said dryly, "you may want to postpone this. The County Ethics Commission is watching. And apparently, so is Channel 6. Barbara turned red, but she didn't cancel the vote. She stormed out of the room. Friday night ended without a word from her. But Saturday morning began with a different sound altogether. Silence. No foot patrol, no clipboard clicks, no plastic violation envelopes. Instead, 2 unmarked cars were parked quietly outside Barbara's home. 2 men in plain suits stepped out. One had a briefcase, the other a county badge. They didn't knock. They walked straight into the HOA's converted garage office, badges held up, and stayed for over an hour. Barbara didn't come out, but when the agents left, they carried boxes. That evening, a notice appeared on the HOA bulletin board. Pending investigation, all board actions temporarily suspended. And then, finally, the neighborhood exhaled. Sunday came like a soft wind. Children played on the sidewalks again. Elderly neighbors sat on porches without fear of a tape measure appearing. Trey brought over lemonade. May brought fresh basil. No one talked about Barbara. They didn't need to. And Lena? She spent the afternoon cataloging evidence. Calm, measured, methodical. Her injury had faded into something like memory, but her purpose? That had only sharpened. That night, she stood under the porch light, staring out across the cul-de-sac like she was reading the future in its silence. "She's not done," I said. Lena didn't blink. "No," she replied, "but neither am I." Behind her, the folders stacked high. The law didn't sleep. And this time, justice wasn't wearing a robe. It was wearing sandals, and it carried a flash drive. It all came to a head on a Thursday morning that began with birdsong and ended with a bang. Barbara's final play arrived not with subtlety, but with a subpoena. We found it duct taped to our front door, an official-looking letterhead from her attorney, demanding Lena appear for a disciplinary deposition regarding defamation, incitement, and obstruction of HOA duties. A bold move, especially considering the real legal firestorm brewing in the background. Lena barely reacted. She peeled the paper off, read it under her breath, and set it beside her coffee. "Desperation smells like toner," she muttered, then went right back to reading through audit files. But even with all the evidence in her hands, Barbara still held one thing: fear. She'd ruled with it for years, and now, in her unraveling, she hoped to resurrect it one last time. So we gave her the only thing she truly feared: a room full of truth. That Friday night, the HOA held a town reconciliation meeting. Barbara didn't organize it. That honor went to Trey and 3 other interim board members, now empowered by a temporary leadership vote. After the previous administration was suspended pending inquiry. It wasn't in the clubhouse this time. It was held in the open on the grassy commons where Barbara once banned sun umbrellas for violating shade regulations, where she once scolded a veteran for leaving a folding chair 12 inches off the property line. The place she tried to control with laminated rules now held folding chairs, lawn blankets, and a mobile PA system, donated by the high school's AV club. People came, not just residents, reporters, legal observers, even a rep from the state auditor's office stood quietly at the back. Barbara came too. She wore a scarf and sunglasses again, but everyone knew who she was. You could see the tension in her steps, the stiffness of someone walking into a house that used to be theirs, only to find the locks changed. Lena didn't sit on stage. She stood off to the side, letting the others speak first. May shared how Barbara once fined her for using purple flowers in her front yard. An older man with Parkinson's read aloud the warning letter he received for involuntary noise pollution during tremors. A single mother spoke about being reported to child services after her son drew with chalk on the sidewalk. One by one, they stood. Ordinary people, neighbors, whose stories, once isolated and shameful, now formed a chorus of clarity. Barbara sat through it all, white-knuckled, lips tight. Then Lena stepped forward. No robe, no gavel, just truth. "Some of you may not know who I am," she began, voice calm, but carrying across the lawn. "I'm not here tonight as a judge. I'm not here seeking revenge. I'm here because silence is a choice, and I don't make that choice when people abuse power." She spoke of the flyers, the harassment, the manipulated HOA votes. She referenced the audit under investigation, the forged vendor contracts, the cousin with the shell company. All of it, without drama, just precision. Barbara stood up mid-speech. "This is character assassination," she shouted. "You're not even part of this community." Lena turned slowly. "I live here. I pay dues. I help my neighbors carry their groceries. I plant tomatoes. I clean up after my dog. That is this community. You just ruled it like it was a kingdom. Silence. Then Trey stepped up and placed a thick envelope on the table. These, he said, are copies of the financial records now in the hands of the DA's office. If anyone would like to understand what Barbara's leadership cost us, here it is. And then he turned to Lena. I believe it's time to vote. One by one, residents cast slips into a clear acrylic box. This wasn't just theater. It was a real vote. In accordance with the revised bylaws Lena had quietly helped revise behind the scenes. The motion: to permanently ban Barbara from any leadership role within the HOA, and to submit a community-endorsed complaint to the state licensing board. The result? Unanimous. Even Barbara's former allies voted against her. She stormed away before it was over, kicking dust onto the grass with those same designer heels she'd once used to knock down Lena's crutches. No one stopped her. No one chased. She walked alone into the night and didn't come back. By Sunday morning, the house at the end of Sycamore Drive had a for sale sign in front of it. Barbara was gone, and with her, the grip of fear that had haunted Rosewood Hills. But this isn't a story about her. It never was. It's about what happens when someone decides to stop being afraid. It's about the power of calm defiance, quiet strategy, and law in service of people, not against them. And Lena? She didn't ask for thanks. But the next time she took a walk through the neighborhood, without crutches this time, people waved. Children smiled. A teenager on a skateboard slowed down just enough to shout, "You're awesome, Miss Lena!" She just smiled and kept walking. A new HOA board was installed 2 weeks later, transparent, community-led, and accountable. Violations were reviewed. Fines refunded. The ramp, once called an eyesore, now had potted flowers on either side, placed there by a neighbor who said, "Let's do it right this time." Justice didn't arrive with thunder. It came with paperwork, patience, and purpose. And though Lena returned to her bench 3 months later, the real verdict had already been delivered. By her neighbors, by the state, and by a community that finally remembered how to stand together. So if someone ever tells you that one person can't change the rules, remind them what happened in Rosewood Hills. And if you ever feel small, silenced, or steamrolled by people who mistake authority for immunity, remember this: you don't need to yell to be powerful. You don't need a robe to deliver justice. And sometimes all it takes to tear down a paper crown is one well-placed truth. So that's how it ended, not with revenge, but with justice. Not with shouting, but with the quiet, unwavering force of the law. And not through power, but through someone brave enough to say, "Enough." Barbara didn't lose because someone out-yelled her. She lost because she underestimated the one thing she couldn't manipulate. Someone who knew the system better than she did and used it, not to destroy, but to heal. As for Lena, she never needed to win the crowd. She didn't fight to be applauded. She did what was right simply because it was right. The lesson here is painfully clear. In a world where people in power often hide behind rules they twist for their own gain, never underestimate the strength of someone with clarity and purpose. Sometimes, the person you thought was fragile is the one quietly rewriting all the rules. And a single cruel act, like kicking someone's crutches, can trigger the unraveling of an entire empire built on fear. If you've ever felt cornered by an unfair system or bullied by those who think they're untouchable, remember, you're not alone, and you are far stronger than they want you to believe. If this story hit home, comment 1 below to let me know you want more real stories where justice hits back. If this didn't quite land for you, comment 0. I want to hear how I can make these stories even better for you. And of course, like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that standing up for what's right can still change everything. Because at the end of the day, justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks on crutches and still stands taller than anyone else.